Uh, Good morning, friends, and we are very happy to have all of you with us this morning for this webinar series. And this is the third series in our webinar in the campus ministry. And the webinar series focuses on building a culture of care on campus. And when we thought of this theme, culture of care, last year, and we didn't have this much of pandemic situation. But this pandemic situation confirmed our theme, and then this is a need of the hour. We need to develop a culture of care when the students also, when they go out into the society, in the larger society, they need to go with this culture of care, with the attitude and the philosophy that we live not only for ourselves, we also live for others. And others also matter to us for our own living. So this is what we want to do through United Board, because as United Board, our vision is whole person education. And we strongly feel that campus ministry is an important contributor to the whole person education. And we strengthen this whole person education through different activities of the campus ministry. And this is one of the important services to the students. And today for our webinar on a specific theme, spiritual life coaching, cultivating empathy as practice of incarnation, we have with us Reverend Dr. Soo-Young Kwon from Korea, and he is an eminent scholar and a great speaker. He's a dean of the College of Theology and a professor of pastoral theology and the director of the Center for Counseling and Coaching Services at United Graduate School of Theology of Yonsei University in Seoul, Korea. Dr. Kwon earned his doctorate in religion and psychology from the Graduate Theological Union in 2003. He is an ordained minister of the United Methodist Church, the author of more than 20 books, and a three-time recipient of the Yonsei University Faculty Award for Teaching Excellence. He has served as the president of the Korean Association of Christian Counseling and Psychology since 2016 and the president of the Korean Association of Couple and Family Counseling and the Association for the Korean Counseling Professionals in 2017. Dr. Kwon's research include pastoral theology, multicultural counseling, spirituality, integrated psychotherapy. So his profile talks a lot about his passion for this field, and I'm sure that today we all will be benefited through his session. And I welcome Dr. Kwon on behalf of United Board. I also welcome all the members from United Board and all the participants from different parts of Asia. Thank you so much for joining us. And I hand over the session to Dr. Kwon. And maybe if you have any questions, please put it in the question and answer session. In the question and answer in the WebEx, you have to choose host and the presenter. When you put the question, please choose host and the presenter, and we'll see your questions. And at the end, Dr. Kwon will answer the questions. Over to Dr. Kwon. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Spurgeon. Hello, everyone. I'm both humbled and honored to be invited to this wonderful webinar series of building a culture of care. Let me share my PowerPoint first. Okay. I'm Korean, and I teach pastoral care and counseling in the Graduate School of Theology at Yonsei University. Yonsei University is one of the representative Christian universities in Korea. Building a culture of care is really good topic. It's my long-standing research topic and definitely a timely issue for all of us, university chaplains, campus ministers, and faculty members for college students. Let me introduce myself first. I had lived in the United States for more than 10 years and got my MDiv and PhD, and I was trained as a pastoral counselor in the United States. Later, I have been working as a professor of pastoral theology in Korea for 18 years since then, trying to find the ways in which Asians care about people with a culturally bound method. Uh, in Korea, students' visits to counseling offices are associated with having some pathological problems like depression or compersions. Therefore, until their psychological or spiritual issues became extremely bad, students often struggle alone without looking for any professional counselors. So I began to look for a term to replace counseling service for Koreans. Recently, coaching is recognized as an essential service to personal growth and considered a positive psychological tool to bring about change. Started as a coaching for corporation leaders and terms for business success or coaching for students' career development has gained importance. Yonsei University, which I belong to, is a large university and a prestigious university. So it is one of the first Christian universities established by American missionaries in 1885. But students are now much more non-Christians. So we made a new name for the field of pastoral counseling with my fellow professors now 15 years ago. Instead of pastoral counseling, we changed department name to counseling and coaching. Students think that pastoral counseling is a counseling given by pastors to evangelize or a counseling session to become a minister. Although the word counseling has already begun with a concept that is different from psychotherapy in the United States back in the 1940s, it is still contains pathological implications in Korea. So a new concept called coaching was needed. Today, I propose to apply the term spiritual life coaching to the university chaplain's work for the spiritual growth and formation or of college students. Adapting the role of a spiritual life coach, the university chaplain or campus minister can build a positive rapport with students, listening to them deeply and empathizing with their emotions and life experiences effectively, I believe. Uh, why empathy? Today's topic is about empathy. Um, we had a very good opportunity to learn about listening in the first webinar led by Dr. Soo-Young Kwon. Today, I'm going to deal with empathy, another basic skill in counseling, and I believe the most important technique in spiritual life coaching. We need to talk about why empathy is important, not only in counseling, but also in spiritual life coaching. In particular, we need to deal with why empathy is more important to Asians. Surveys conducted on multiracial clients in the United States consistently show that Asian clients have the highest tendency to terminate or drop out of counseling in the early stages. The reason given for this phenomenon is that Asians are unaccustomed to the culture of psychotherapy due to shame or humiliation. What do you think? Is 100% explained by these cultural factors alone? Do you think Asians are so embarrassed and awkward that they can't tell their stories enough in front of professionals like counselor or psychotherapist and give up halfway? I thought there was not enough explanation just for cultural differences. I think only half of cultural factors are explained. For Asians, the first session is very important in both counseling and psychotherapy. Although it is true that a relatively low ratio of Asians seek counseling or psychotherapy, these clients generally have higher expectations and depend seriously on these initial sessions more than Western clients because it takes a lot of courage and determination for Asian clients to see a counselor. If the expected results do not occur within a short time, then Asian clients are quick to evaluate counseling negatively and leave the session. From this viewpoint, it can be said that only counseling sessions determine the success or failure of counseling provided for Asian clients in general, and Koreans in particular. It is difficult to achieve a meaningful connection with the Korean clients in early sessions simply by collecting client information, which is a process that commonly occurs during the early stages of counseling in the United States. How is this most important mutual experience in early counseling achieved in the initial meeting? This would be the same question for campus ministers and chaplains seeking to provide spiritual life coaching. In his book, A Listening Ear, do you know this book? A Listening Ear, a reflection on Christian caring. Swiss physician Paul Trunier indicates that doctors who examine and appropriately diagnose patients can only see what they are prepared to see. That is, otorhinolaryngologists only focus on the ear or nose, whereas ophthalmologists only see the patient's eye. With these doctors, it is unimportant to observe an entire human or conduct a self-examination of human being. Trunier goes on to contend that genuine encounter between the patient and the doctor is the most important factor in accomplishing a deeper relationship with the patient. This feeling of meeting and communion is explained as a spiritual experience achieved in the presence of God. This feeling of meeting and communion can be achieved depending on the perspective of the physician who examines the patient for the very first time. This viewpoint prioritized the degree of pain rather than area of pain. Although particular area that doctors wish to look at may be the specialized domain that they want to study, it does not thoroughly reveal the pain and agony that the patient is experiencing. In other words, although uh, ophthalmologists can perform the professional act of examining and curing the patient's eye, it is difficult to achieve communion with the sincere feelings toward the patient. The doctor may be able to encounter the wounded eye, but will not be able to personally understand the emotional worlds of the hurting persons who suffers from physical pain, experiences frustration from not being able to see the loved ones, and feels guilt about the hardship experienced by his family members due to his eye pain. I have become uh, deeply interested in whether this type of encounter can be achieved in counseling or life coaching, particularly during the early sessions, early stages of counseling or coaching. It is most important for the counselor or coach to emotionally understand the clients during the early session of conversation, particularly in Korea. This is easier said than done. The first temptation encountered by most counselors is to become interested in quickly understanding the presenting issue, symptoms of the client. This naturally uh, makes some counselors focus on collecting clients' personal information and familial information. The genuine bias possessed by such counselors is that it is acceptable to consume much time and effort in questioning and collecting basic information during the early counseling sessions, in particular, the first day of counseling. I believe that this is the shortcut that prompts Asian clients, including Koreans, to drop out of the counseling process in the early stages. Because most Asians, particularly Koreans, place significant emphasis on saving face and feel easily humiliated by authority in collectivist culture. It takes an incredible amount of emotional energy to talk about one's internal secrets and problems to an unfamiliar counselor who is regarded as authority. Thus, if the client does not feel that he or she is being emotionally understood by the counselor during the early stage of counseling, there is a high possibility that the counseling will quickly end in failure. If empathy is viewed as a process for managing the proper feelings for and fitting together of the client's needs and the counselor's response, the process of emotionally understanding the clients must become the first step of empathy. One might identify this process as a building an empathic bond. The life coaching process is no exception. Can we practice empathy? Well, then whether it is a counselor or a life coach, it is most important to empathize emotionally at the beginning of the first meeting and the first conversation. You should ask one big question. Is empathy a natural disposition, or is it a skill that you can do better through training? Simply put, can we practice empathy? Some people call it temperament. It is said that the women usually have a natural tendency of empathy compared to men. Empathy has is temperament and in that respect, right? But the skills of empathy that we are trying to do today are obviously going to focus on empathy that can be practiced. I'm even going to argue today that you and I are Christians and have theological resources to empathize much better with the students we meet than anyone else. Empathy is always thought of only as psychological resources in us because I believe that when we use theological resources, we will be more empathetic ministers than anyone else. Theologically, I believe that empathy starts with God, who incarnated in Christ, sharing the most miserable experiences of the world. The meaning of pastoral counseling and spiritual life coaching helps us root empathy, the fundamental skill in our pastoral services, in our daily encounter with God's incarnation. I would like to first explain theological resources with the uh, etymology of the word empathy. The etymological meaning of empathy is empathia, meaning into suffering. The empathy is different from sympathy, an English word that means compassion, in that it empathizes into uh, rather than with. For example, a passerby may feel anxiety uh, with the person that has fallen into a pit and express sympathy by offering hand to help him or her out. On the other hand, empathy is more active expression of compassion presented by the passerby who personally lowers himself or herself into the pit and pushes the fallen person out from the bottom of the pit. Perhaps the depth is too deep. All they can do is hug and cry together. Perhaps they can come to an end there, empathizing with each other. That's what empathy is all about. I believe that the empathy in pastoral counseling postulates an attitude that sums up incarnation, the essence of Christian theology. Uh, many theologians in the history of Christianity have devoted themselves to pursuing the fundamental meaning of the theological questions. Why did God become human, right? For instance, Anselm of Canterbury, who is also called the father of scholasticism, in the Middle Age, attempted to analyze and explain the incarnation of God purely based on reason. In the beginning of his book, Why God Became Human, Cur Deus Homo, Anselm laments irrational faith by stating the following: the will of God ought to be a sufficient reason for us when He does anything, even if we do not see why He will thus, for the will of God is never unreasonable. In this context, Angelum remarks that it is necessary to cast light upon God, who has been wounded by the sin and corruption of humans, arguing the rational need for the incarnation of God in relation to our inability to restore uns or dishonor. As the sin of damaging God's honor can only be atoned through the combination of justice and sacrifice, the incarnation of God is inevitable, and the hardship and death of Jesus are nothing but righteous. This may appear to be a plausible explanation for the incarnation of God. However, the relationship between God and human being is centered on liability. In other words, human beings file for bankruptcy when they are unable to pay for their debts, which are settled by God instead. Reasoning eventually devours life. Incarnation is buried within the fortress of doctrine based on logic and reasoning. And the image of Jesus as a human being is that has shared life, suffering, death with us gradually dims. The image of Jesus suffering into earth as a human being may disappear from incarnation theology, replaced by the image of God who has come to pay the debts of our sin. I intend to examine critically by uh, the critically Anselm's approach in order to develop a new theological understanding and practice of incarnation by using the context of our pastoral experience on campus. The incarnated image of a human Jesus enhances the clinical behavior of empathizing with a wounded client in pastoral counseling or spiritual life coaching. The act of understanding a certain person is similar to the incarnation process in which Jesus Christ suffered into earth as a human being. I encourage this incarnational perspective with the students when they are first attempting to learn pastoral counseling and with counselors who wish to emotionally understand new clients. The important issue is that how the counselor steps into the client's shoes. Understanding another person can be described as understanding, understanding on the very bottom floor of the person's pain and suffering. The true model of understanding was presented by God who became human to stand under, that is, at the very bottom of human reality, at a place of suffering and death. Empathic understanding may be described as an innate attitude that is present only in certain people. In other words, warm-hearted personality that easily sympathizes with the pain and suffering of other people. Again, we are not going to discuss this aspect of empathy, effective empathy, we can tell, because counselors and coaches are able to develop the ability to empathize through training and practice. So I would propose a mutual definition of empathy as the proper fitting together of the client's needs, student needs, and the counselor's or coach's response from a pastoral theological perspective. It is a practical model of a mutual empathy in which the chaplains and campus ministers can be trained to understand understand at the very bottom of the students or suffer in through the heart of the students. From the viewpoint of pastoral counseling, not all empathic attempts to feel and share the emotions of the client automatically transgress past with uh, stage, sympathy stage, to become into empathy stage. The incarnation experience of sharing pain from within is an experience of stepping into the client's student's shoes to understand the client and is thus different from the simple act of sharing emotions. In first webinar last time, we learned about pseudo-listening from Dr. Soo-Young Kwon. Today, I'd like to introduce three pseudo-empathy. It is very easy for us to use this pseudo-empathy and make mistakes to the students we meet on campus. Uh, the first pseudo-empathy is self-revelation. The first type of a response that must be distinguished from empathic understanding is self-revelation. In order to understand the suffering of the other person and express sincere empathy, we attempted to let the other person know that we possess similar experiences. Instead of understanding the deepest emotions of the student, the counselor, the adult coach, remembers a similar health problem he or she has experienced in the past and prioritizes the act of experiencing empathy to the student. The moment that the counselor reveals himself or herself to express empathy, even with a well intended purpose of convincing the clients that his or her problem is a surmountable issue that is commonly experienced by many, many people, the counseling session begins to progress in an unintended direction, and the counselor still fails to step into the shoes of the client. Once the counselor reveals a very similar dilemma or crisis to that of the client is likely to request a detailed explanation of the experiences revealed by the counselors in an attempt to substitute himself or herself within the counselor's personal experiences. In other words, the client requests greater accuracy and concreteness for the self-revelation that was presented by the counselor in an attempt to express empathy. Rather than feeling empathy for the fact that the counselor too experienced a similar disease, the client concentrates on the experience of the counselor to satisfy his or her curiosity or resist facing his or her own situation. In a flash, the direction of counseling is moved from the experience of the client to that of the counselor. Although unintended, the counselor has no choice but to continuously reveal his or her personal experiences rather than focusing on the client's problems. After counseling session, the clients will not remember the common denominator shared between his or her own experience and counselors, which was exposed to established empathy for the client's problem, but will rather dislocate his or her problem from the similar yet different experience of the counselor. The client may feel that the counselor has abandoned his or her problem or sense the absence of the counselor in viewing the client's problem as a separate issue from the counselor. In this regard, self-revelation is an impediment to empathy because it provides the client with a sense of dislocation or separation from his or her issue. In my supervising experiences, counselors in training feel that self-revelation is appropriate if the personal experiences are very similar to those of the client. Although, although this may appear to be an effective shortcut to empathy, the era of self-revelation is that it focuses the session on the counselor's experiences rather than the possibility of self-revelation in arousing empathy to concentrate on the client. Self-revelation can certainly change the direction of the counseling session by making the client become more interested in the problems exposed by the counselor. In the process of training counselors, I occasionally meet counselors that feel the need to reveal themselves. Those counselors argue that it is impossible to prevent making appropriate self-revelation regarding similar experiences to the clients. I respond by encouraging them to express self-definition of emotion instead of self-revelation of experience. The counselor can define the emotion felt during a similar experience and express this emotion to the client rather than exposing oneself by saying, I also underwent similar surgery. The counselor can use the experience of express the emotions that she felt at the time. Wow, how frightening it must have been to be diagnosed with the cancer without having prior symptoms. Even if the surgery was success, you must have experienced the depression symptoms because the complications. It must have been very painful. Like this. In this regard, the process in which the counselor diagnoses the emotions felt by the client plays a very important role in mediating the inner emotions of the client. Generalization is the second clinical approach that bears like the likeness of empathy. Although many counselors realize that it is not uh, advisable to generalize the client's problems in the counseling session. It is definitely, one of the most frequent mistakes made by counselors. In other words, that if the client appears to carry the weight of the word on his or her own shoulders, the counselor tends to make decision to reduce the weight of the problems by generalizing the issue to the certain degree. The most common example is to imagine a counselor who encounters the concerns of college students we meet in the current COVID-19 pandemic situation. Suppose you met a senior student who experienced poor learning and was worried about, entering society after graduation in a pandemic situation. Isn't this most common pseudo empathy? Like, hey, maybe you are not the only one who's worried because we all going through this pandemic right now on this globe. Maybe it's a worry that every student of your age is experiencing, right? So cheer up. The generalized personality type that was presented by the counselor to help the client gain self-understanding and awaken positive resources within may be comprehensible to most people when viewing the client's problem statistically. The solution provided by the counselor is in relation to this analysis may seem like a powerful, effective prescription. However, there are very few clients that can actually accept such solution. This is because the intervention of generalized counseling only serves as a temporarily expedient in many cases. When introduced to one's true self, analyzed through psychological assessment, the client may nod his or her head in agreement with some aspects, but will not be able to shake off a feeling of inadequacy regarding the counseling session. The empathy that the clients wishes to receive is not an indirect understanding provided by the general statistics or psychological assessment. Instead, it is an experiential understanding achieved with the counselor with whom the client is sharing his or her stories. In many cases, the client would feel that generalization is an act of temporarily covering up his or her emotional wound and pushing him or her back into the world without regard for his or her actual condition. Covered by a band-aid, the client's wound will fester without fully healing. The final pseudo-empathy is mental neglect. The aim of counseling is to be absorbed with observing the deep inner emotions of the client. Occasionally, a counselor may take interest in the problems of third parties that surrounded the client. Of course, these third parties are people who, the people that the counselor has usually never met before, the characters that are behind the scenes of the counseling session. For this reason, counselors are sometimes compared with uh, adventurers that explore the unknown world or archaeologists that dig up relics in historic sites. Although counselors do not intend to neglect the client, the desire to achieve empathy with the client may lead to mental neglect when become preoccupied with people outside the counseling room without realizing it. Once again, imagine a conversation with a college student in this pandemic situation. Imagine that there is a college student who is restless because he cannot live up to his parents' expectations. His parents keep telling him or her to apply for an internship to get a job, but the student is not confident. In that case, the counselor becomes a parent without even realizing it, saying, "Stop running away like that and give it a try." Some counselors even say that they are confident that students' parents will never scold them for not making it. Even though counselors have no idea what kind of personality or attitude students' parents are, the student must feel as if he was talking to his parents. In no event does preoccupation of the third party contribute to positive results in counseling. In other words, the counselor cannot make any clinical assessment before meeting and consulting with significant others outside the counseling room. As soon as the counselor jumps to conclusions, a triangular relationship is formed between the clients, the outside others, and counselor. Many counselors experience resistance from their clients by making the mistakes of speaking for a third party related to the client, even in a situation where the client asks the counselor for his or her opinion on the third party. Counselors must make clinical efforts to focus the session on the issue of the client. The client's experience of mental neglect may cause an irreconcilable breach in a fragile empathic bond. Now, let's see what we can do with the genuine empathy. And let's take a look at how to cultivate empathy in our initial conversation with our students. Empathy is not just a natural disposition. Then I will explain to you. Now, let's practice empathy in 3 stages from now on. What is significant about exploring pseudo-empathy or barriers to authentic empathy are the implications for the specific process of empathic understanding. In order to explain empathic understanding in counseling or life coaching, I used to employ a particular figure of speech, the metaphor of elevator. In the counseling process, the counselor and the client are each riding separate elevators uh, of mind, I would say. This elevator operates from the underground to the ground floor. To compare it with a human body, the counseling related with the mind, the cognitive element is similar to the elevator operating on the ground floors, whereas the counseling related with the heart, emotional element is similar to the elevator operating on the ground floors. The counselor must remember that in order to achieve empathy, the counselor and the client must take the elevator to the same floor during the counseling session. In particular, counseling becomes difficult if the counselor operates the elevator to the ground floor when the client is headed to the underground floor. Uh, the problem is that it is very uncommon for clients to operate the elevator to the underground floor on their own. The success or failure of empathy is determined by whether or not the counselor can quickly move down to the underground floor. In short period of time, the client remains underground. Counselors that remain in the mind of the client not only fail to feel the client's heart, but also foolishly pulled up the client's elevator from the underground floor. The previously introduced processes of self-revelation and generalization prevent the counselor from the jumping down to the underground floor with the client and easily create the cognitive response that triggers the client to move to a higher ground floor. Thus, the counselor must be equipped with the clinical sensitivity to promptly react during the moment the client attempts to move underground. The client, after remaining on ground floors for a certain period, uses words to express personal emotions when descending to the underground floor. In this situation, the reaction of the counselor that descends with the client is an essential element of empathy. The following example of generalization, mental neglect, and self-revelation presents how the chaplain fails to ride on the same underground floor with the student when the student both verbally and non-verbally expresses her emotions. Uh, Chaplains say, now I heard that fear of the future keeps coming, but when exactly did you start to feel fear? Student said, I don't think there's a specific starting point. At our age, we all think about the future, right? Then everyone can feel some confidence, but sometimes they can feel fear, especially when it's hard to get a job for young people like these days. You can see students is moving to underground, expressing his or her emotion verbally, right? I can feel feel fear, fear. I can. Uh, I'm not confident. But the chaplain said, so if you don't feel afraid in this pandemic situation, that's all right. I'm sure it's not just your feeling. uh, so he's generalized, right? And he's still on the ground floor. Student said, "You're right. I also think that I might be too afraid of my own problems, but sometimes I feel lonely again." He said, the feeling. I feel lonely because I think everyone can endure it well. Student still staying on the underground floor. But unfortunately, the chaplain said, well, that's probably how you feel. Other friends are nervous too. Can you see pseudo-empathy here? So you might be mistaken to think they are good at it. This is just kind of mental neglect. It is focusing on, the people outside the counseling room, right? So student said, that's right. Maybe I'm being too sensitive, but it's really scary. Again, he expressing, his emotion. It's really scary when I feel helplessness. Wow, I feel helpless that I might not be able to do anything. And voice chokes up. Is expressed non-verbally now. Uh, the student is anxiously waiting on the underground floor. But, Chaplin said, I really think it's time for that. I really had a similar experience, just as old as you are. That's when the world was really unstable um, due to the international financial crisis like now. Maybe back in, uh, 2008 or something. It's still ground floor. Student, similar experience? Tell me more detail. Uh, Finally, student is back to the ground floor. See? Of course, you wouldn't have this conversation, would you? I just showed you an example of a bass conversation using uh, previously mentioned three pseudo-empathy to explain three stages of genuine empathy. Uh, I will now elaborate on this three stages process in which the chaplain can jump to the underground floor with the student to achieve empathy. In the first stage, the chaplain must personally feel the emotion of the client who is attempting to descend to the underground floor. This is most important stage which requires both sensitivity and training. The client may express his or her emotions verbally, but may also use other various nonverbal expressions like tearing up or choking up. Uh, Incarnational efforts are required for the chaplain to attentively listen to and observe the student's reaction. In other words, the chaplain must suffer in from the bottom of the student's emotional pit. Second stage is the self-definition of emotion, a page during which the chaplain independently defines and expresses his or her emotion for the student. I believe that the concept of Christian incarnation provides a good prototype for this stage, self-definition. Jesus' death on the cross serves as a gospel for Christians not only because his resurrection. The death on the cross could have become a formality for Jesus, the Son of God. For example, if God had created Jesus to be incapable of feeling pain, or if Jesus had ascended to the heavens from the cross as if to mock the Roman soldiers or the Jewish public, Jesus may have become a savior unrelated with the suffering of human beings. However, Jesus became a savior of joy to all human beings in suffering and pain solely because he personally felt and experienced the most difficult hardships and the most humiliating death. The Bible testifies that Jesus possessed nail scarred hands and spear marks in his waist even after resurrection. The resurrected Jesus is not recreated as a magically sound image unrelated with pain and suffering. Instead, he returns to life carrying the wounds of human beings. From his birth to his return to the heavens, Jesus never stopped empathizing with the pain and suffering of human beings. The death of Jesus on the cross is self-definition of God's wounded heart for the suffering of mankind. On the cross, Jesus professes that is it truly a heavy task to feel pain and experience death as a human being. This confession is presented in the scene in which Jesus cries to the Father in heaven, my God, um, why have you forsaken me?" However, God the Father was not in the heavens at the time, but was also dying on the cross of Jesus, God the Son. Remember the Passion of the Christ, the movie the Mel Gibson directed. Gibson tried to portray Jesus' suffering most accurately in this movie. Actors were asked to use the language that Jesus himself used, not English. However, God's wounded heart overlooking the cross is very symbolic. Do you remember the scene when Jesus died on the cross? Let's take a look at this the video clip. Certainly, something was created above the clouds in the sky. Uh, Tears like thick raindrops were made and fell under the cross like a atomic bomb. In this regard, Jesus' death on the cross is self definition of God's wounded heart. There's no power in the universe that can harm God, but the suffering of the sacrifice breaks God's heart. I believe that the cross signifies God's sincere engagement in human suffering and the self definition of God's wounded heart for them, rather than depicting uh, memorial service of sacrifice for saving mankind from sin. Thus, the death of Jesus serves as an example of suffering experienced by a guiltless sacrifice, enabling us to feel a sense of companionship through the innocent death. Perhaps this is why Luther stated that God meets people in suffering and death. This is also joyful news for pastoral counselors and ministers like us. The cross is a meeting place between God and humans. To be more specific, the suffering of humans serves as a meeting place between God and humankind. This is why counseling or coaching sessions for healing wounds serve as the meeting place between student, minister, and God. Hereupon, I wish to examine the question of why God became human from the viewpoint of pastoral theology in relation to the agony and sorrow for God. A Korean theologian, Andrew Song Park, wrote the Wounded Heart of God, which received much attention from many theologians in the United States. Although Park was interested in the forgiveness of sins committed by rulers, which is a topic significantly covered in Western theological tradition, he argued that these doctrines disregard the problem of wounded heart, the Korean concept of Han, possessed by those sacrificed by the sin, and stated that it is impossible to understand the true cross of God if the problem of sin and wounded heart are not considered together. For similar reasons, I would go on to claim that the logical explanation argued by doctrinal theology, which states that God had no choice but to become human in order to pay off human debts, seems like a rather wild speculation that attempts to explain the heart of God through the human mind. In other words, although God's elevator is located on the ground floor, people judge God based on their reason and logic from the highest ground floor. It is impossible to explain the correlation between the reason for God's incarnation with the human life and God's own suffering in the life and death of Christ if we do not encounter God's wounded heart on the underground level. The act of understanding clients in counseling sessions is identical to impersonating the incarnation of God, who has descended to the very bottom of human suffering to understand at the bottom of our pain and sorrow. The same things are possible in our life coaching conversation with our students. Thus, pastoral site of the chaplain is the place in which chaplain can feel and express God's wounded heart. Like God, like God, we have to define our students' feelings by ourselves. It is desperately necessary for us to be in pain together with our students. I feel you will be too helpless. Yes, I feel you will be too scared. Uh, Reframing is the third stage, achieved directly after the chaplain feels the emotion of the students and independently defines and expresses his or her personal feelings for the student. Reframing is achieved by repeating the question of how the student feels within his or her own situational framework. This procedure mediates the emotions of the chaplain toward the student and the student's actual emotions. In this situation, the student widely opens the elevator door to the underground floor to share with the chaplains the personal inner emotions that are located deep within. The following examines the previous verbatim according to the stages of the empathy process. Stage one, emotion of student felt by the chaplain. Student said, "That's right. Maybe I'm too sensitive, but it's really scary when I feel helpless that I might not be able to do anything." And boy chokes up. This is stage one. In the chaplain feel the student feels scary and helplessness. Stage two, chaplain's self-definition of emotion. Chaplain said, "Your voice choked up all of a sudden. I feel like you are now caught up in more than just the normal college senior's future worries. It appears to me that you are trying very hard to hold back your tears." So stage two is a chaplain defines students' inner feelings by himself or self. The stage three is reframing through student. So uh, the chaplain said, "How do you hear what I'm saying?" Or you could say, "How is it like for you? Can you tell me a little more what it is you really feel?" Then, the the student, the crying, But to be honest, life feels so empty these days. I don't even know what I'm living for. I feel depressed and hopeless. Wipes tears. So this stage, chaplain stays on the same level, same underground level of students' emotion world. Do you know why the people cannot empathize with people who just want to cry? It's just that I believe crying together in the emotional basement doesn't help solve the problem. So when we see people crying, we immediately comfort them to tell them not to cry, but to cheer up. If so, keep in mind that Jesus Christ coming down to earth for our wounded hearts, shedding tears together, and experiencing the most miserable humiliation of human beings on the cross is no different from the attitude that it does not help solve the problem. When these, three stages of empathy are carried out throughout our coaching session, the student is able to experience a sincere encounter with the minister, who has jumped into the elevator with the student. The chaplain feels the sorrow or pain of student by listening to the student's voice chalked up. As we can see, the stage one. If the stage ends with the chaplain merely feeling such emotions, the chaplain cannot jump into the student's elevator and follow her to the underground floor. Thus, the procedure of self-definition in which the chaplain verbally defines her emotions to express these feelings to the student becomes a very important part of empathy. Stage two. This moment can be viewed as the point in which the chaplain jumps into the student's elevator to enter the underground floor, when the chaplain asks the student to re-experience the pain within the framework of the student through reframing. The student will open the elevator door on the underground floor and share private emotions with the chaplain to create empathy. So the stage three is formed. It is essential that the chaplain performs self-definition without expanding to analytic interpretations like professional counselor or psychotherapist. The chaplain does not need to pursue a professional analytic ability to, analyze or accuracy regarding the unconscious of the student. Discussion regarding the unscientific, inaccurate aspect of empathy on psychoanalysis, criticism only restricted to the interpretation of empathy. If empathy is to be understood as a process that manages the proper feeling for and feeding together of the patient's needs and analyst
Uh,
response based on
Dr. Kwan,
Arnold.
another 5 minutes, maybe, maybe.
Okay,
Yeah,
okay.
yeah, yeah.
Arnold Goldberg definition. The completion of empathy is based on the mutual experience composed between two people. For those that believe empathy to be the perception or cognition process of the client, empathic understanding will always occupy a passive position in unilaterally waiting for the emotional identification of the counselor or interpreter within the unconscious of the client. Okay, as insisted by Daniel Stern, empathy is not privileged means of observation, but rather a perspective. What the analyst considers to be empathetically derived knowledge, according to Stern, is partially a product of personal processes. Those relying on empathy as a privileged mode of perception assume that the experiences to be achieved by all already there in the other person, awaiting the analyst empathic attunement or identification. This ignores what Stern considered to be how fully analyst and patient participate moment to moment in construction of one another experience, how they co-create everything that takes place in the analysis. As the last stage of empathy, reframing, stage three, serves as an important moment in which the counselor or coach and the client share mutual experiences to achieve empathic construction of one another experience. Let me conclude. Based on the importance of empathy in early counseling sessions in Korean context, today we attempted to find a way to practice empathy in pastoral conversation on campus. I thought we needed more access to life coaching for students visiting chaplains rather than counseling or psychotherapy. In order to do so, I thought that empathy was desperately needed when putting the first button of the conversation with the students. I explained the three stages of empathy by providing a verbatim example. These stages enable the chaplain as a spiritual life coach to feel the emotional pain of the student, express these emotions to the student, and help the student to reframe his or her feelings within an experiential framework. I think I introduced a method that most chaplains that like consistent training on psychoanalytic observation and interpretation can utilize to manage. In our, the Goldberg's definition of empathy, the proper feeling for and feeding together of the student needs and chaplain's response from the early stages of conversation. Furthermore, this provides us with a very important task of a pastoral theology in that chaplains and campus ministers can practice incarnational human understanding in response to the calling of God. The incarnation of God is not only a historical truth that happened more than 2,000 years ago in the Jewish land, but also a pastoral virtue that must be newly experienced and practiced every day in our pastoral ministry. Thank you very much. Thank you for listening.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Kwon. Uh, you can stop sharing your screen,
Okay.
but we got some questions already from the participants.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll put it in the slide. Maybe we'll take few questions first, and if time
Okay.
permits, we can go to the other questions. Yuka, can you put it on the slide?
Mm-hmm.
I have asked our colleague to put the questions on the slide, which you can see now.
Okay. I can see the first question here. Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
yeah.
Okay.
How
Yeah.
can a counselor build a relationship with a genuine empathetic understanding without knowing the living verb of the client?
Yeah,
Uh,
I think I already mentioned that we have we consume we as much as we know our students or faculty members personal information, we better understand their mind or heart. But what I'm arguing today is no, we have to understand emotionally our student or faculty member first, because sometimes they are very anxiously share their own feeling, but they never expose their feeling to anybody. So in very early stage, I believe uh, we have to touch their heart, touch their uh, emotional world first, so that they feel like, wow, this is a very the theorist that called uh, correctional experience of emotion is the really key to uh, open their hearts to you and me. So I think a genuine empathic understanding starts with the touching their hidden emotion in very early stage. So that will be my answer. But we everyone many counselor uh, you know made a mistake. Have made a mistake. They keep asking their personal information, and they like to sketch their whole life within a short period of time, or first session, second session, but they never dealt with their the client's emotional world. So that's the big mistake, and there's the high tendency to the fail uh, their session.
okay,
Okay, second
the
question.
next second question is there a
Yeah.
clear delineation of when students may be needing spiritual counseling that is to be provided by a chaplain or campus minister or might need professional counseling by a registered guidance counselor.
Right. So, I always said my the students who are ministers or chaplains, they have to accept they can do everything. Sometimes we are the spiritual support person. We are a spiritual minister. Then we have we will have to have some knowledge. Oh, this person really need professional help. Sometimes they have a very the clear trauma, or my student may have some attachment trauma in early stage of his or her life. Then we are sometimes have to introduce a professional counselor on campus. So when I was trained in the United States, we often mentioned referment. We have to refer our students to our clients to mental health professional or psychiatrist. Then referment means, hey, you have to see doctor, you have to have some medication from now on. It's not a referment. Referral means you have to introduce a certain professional and let this professional see your student. That's the referral made. So you have to have some list of professionals on campus, right? So the professional counselors, or sometimes psychiatrist, or sometimes facilitator for a certain group, depression group, or you have a list of professionals on your hand, and sometimes you have to the matching professionals with our students. That's the very important task for us to help them to reach professional help. I think that we need to know certain sensitivity, clinical sensitivity. Oh, this person really needs some professional help. That's the very good. Uh, Sometimes we have to have that kind of
Skill.
yeah, it's a ability
Yeah.
to check up.
Okay,
Okay.
Dr. Kwan, we have several questions, but I would take only two questions. One is
Mhm.
here, the other one our Vice President Dr. Waichin will ask directly. The
Okay.
last question from the slide is I would just personally ask to elaborate on how empathy comes with the lens of the incarnational method of Jesus. So far, I understand the into, like how
Hmm.
Jesus dwelt with the humans.
Yes. Yes. Let me see. Uh,
That's a third question, yeah.
yeah, yeah. Yes. Sometimes sympathy is much easier than empathy perspective, because we can suffer together with people who suffer, but sometimes we just we have to forget. I have to save this person, or I have to solve this person's problem. Sometimes we need to stay on people's pain, sometimes very certain period of time, doing nothing. Sometimes they're holding and crying together. That's it. But we feel like, oh, this is not the solution. It's just so we have to say something. Hey, it's not your place. Some get out of your place. So it's not a sympathy stage. Sympathy perspective. But sometimes the God, or Jesus Christ, uh, Jesus Christ is just stayed for for a certain period of time, 30, 33 years sometimes, or uh, he ascended, he ascended to the earth. We often said, but I propose to say he descended into your heart, our heart, sometimes the very bottom of your heart. In my counseling experience, most miserable emotion is humiliation, or the feeling kicked out of you know uh, by my loved ones. It's a really painful experience. So sometimes, any counselor cannot empathize with my feeling because I reject it. I'm useless. I'm miserable. This kind of feeling. But my clients who really had the miserable experience, sometimes, hey, you're college professor, as you're a very famous person. You cannot empathize with myself feeling my rejection, feeling of rejection, or the humiliation. So the Jesus Christ, the cross, is the very uh, important underground field uh, that myself and client and God, we all together here we experience God's empathy in our world, in our the encounter. That's I would argue we have to use our theological resource, our experience of God's empathy when we meet students in our office and counseling room. That's my point.
Okay, okay. Thank you, Dr. Kwan, and I would request our Vice President to ask the last question.
Hello, thank you, Professor Kwon. And
You.
I'm sorry that I take the time. I saw that there are actually a list of questions.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll use this privilege to just ask you one question, because I know there are traumatic cases, or there are the cases like on the edge of referral, then
Mm-hmm.
we should just leave it. I mean, lead it towards that.
Mm-hmm.
But I also have encountered a lot of students who are coming for
Mm-hmm.
life advices, as what you frame, like a life coach or a spiritual life coach. And I really enjoy you bringing into the
Mm-hmm.
Christian concepts of endowment, and
Mm-hmm.
a lot of the strength, inner strength, has to be built
Right. Right.
on from within. So I think the faith aspect is really important.
Mm-hmm.
But very often I also, whether it's right or wrong, I mean, I would come to a point where I feel I have to confront the
Mm-hmm.
student, because sometimes I feel they are drowned too much in self-pitying,
Mm-hmm. Right.
or trapped by the concept that they are the victim. They are
Right.
victimized by everybody around them.
Right. Right.
I mean,
Right.
then I feel, no, I have I hurt quite a bit,
Right.
and I
Right.
feel that
Yeah,
that's
I
a,
understand what you mean. Yeah.
you need to
Right.
go out of that. I mean,
Right.
so where would you suggest would
Yeah.
be the right language or the right time
Right.
for intervention or
Right.
confrontation?
Right. So, we I definitely understand what you're saying, especially these days, young people really, when you said, self-pity, and, I'm the only one, really miserable in the whole world. And so, well, so sometimes they really needed to have solution, or, our guide, spiritual guide. So I think it is a very step by step. The
Mhm.
the first step, I still thinking they feel like, oh, this person, this chaplain is really uh, knows me, means understands my feeling. So and that's the starting point. And then, sometimes the coaching skill is a very important skill, asking questions. So my supervisor, who was, the white female, was a very strict woman professor. He told me, I presume you're a really the bad counselor attitude, because you are a man, you are a Korean, and the doctoral student, because that means you think you have your own answer. So that's the really bad attitude, to be a good counselor or to be good, the life coach. So sometimes, I really have a solution or my own experience to share with my students. But just hold that, and ask them questions, ask a lot of questions. So it's a really the coaching is our art of questioning. So sometimes, asking good questions, they question themselves, and they feel like, oh, I have some resources in my experience or in my life, so that they can use that resources to apply in a future direction. So well, I think emotion is most important starting point, I believe, in my own clinical experience, so that we could step by step, we can help our students, but still not giving them solution, but giving a lot of good questions to question about themselves, their own experience, their resources, their strength. So that's the what life coaching is all about. So solution has what clients have in their own lives.
Thank you. Thank you. That's a wonderful
Yeah.
answer. Maybe I should close this now,
Yes.
Spurgeon, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
One announcement that
Oh, please.
friends, thank you so much. And we have a feedback form, and our colleague Yuga will put it in the chat box. Kindly fill the feedback form, and you can also write to me if you have any suggestion for the future webinars. The next webinar we plan to have in the month of August. We'll keep in touch, and we'll send you the details later. Thank you, Dr. Kwan. I hand over to Dr. Watching for the closing remarks.
Thank you. Thank you, Spurgeon. Thank you, Dr. Kwon. And I'm very impressed by your thoughtful laying out of what counseling, life coaching, and incarnation. I mean, the concept of incarnation, and you draw the relationship together beautifully. And I appreciate very much. I think you have actually, especially in your last comment about your own experience with your supervisor, and your turn to asking more careful, critical questions rather than giving solutions. I think that's a really encouraging way for us working with students to try to accompany them through their life journey, rather than criticizing them. I mean, even for parents, I think we have often committed those issues, those problems, but accompanying them, understanding where they are, maybe asking questions, hopefully that they can find their own resources, inner resources or religious resources to resolve the issue. And that is really a very good promise for them, I believe. So thank you again. And
thank you for having me.
We'll need your advice. As you know, we'll come back to you again. And thank you for all the participants. I saw some of your great questions. If you have, you still want to hear some response to Dr. Kwon, I'm sure he
Sure.
doesn't mind. So we
Absolutely.
can send your questions to him if you really want to have the answers or hear his voice or advice. So thank you again, and thank you for the UB team who has been working very hard behind the scene. So wonderful. Hopefully we'll see you again soon. Thank you, Dr. Kwon.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
감사합니다.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yuka, you have any announcements?
No, sir, I just want, it'll be good if they finish their feedbacks. It will be very useful for us because we want to know about WebEx platform as well. Because we've
Yeah.
access.
Please finish your feedback, because that will be very useful for us for drafting the future programs, and we consider your feedback as very important. Kindly fill the feedback before you leave. Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Kwan.
Thank
Nice
you.
meeting
Thank
you.
you.
It was a
See
good
you
session.
soon.
Yeah, thanks. Bye bye.
Bye
Thank you,
now.
Bye-bye.
thank you, Wai Ching, and thank you
Bye-bye.
other colleagues of mine, Sarah, Victoria, Cooney, and Yuka.